Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Mercury Retrograde, as we have a Mercury Retrograde coming up right around the corner. First of all, what is a retrograde? For those of you who are not so familiar. Retrogrades is when a planet appears to move backwards across the night sky. In astronomy, this phenomena is referred to as apparent retrograde motion because the planet is not actually changing the direction of its orbit around the Sun. It simply appears to move backwards across the sky from our perspective on Earth. And that's because usually one of these planets is overtaking us in its orbit. So this image here that you can see is actually a still image taken over many nights of Mars's retrograde. So it starts in the top right corner and comes diagonally down across the screen and then loops back over itself before beginning to return to direct motion. Now, because Mars is outside of the Earth's orbit, it's further away from the Sun than Earth, we can actually photograph its retrograde like this, because Mars will be at its brightest opposite the Sun when it's retrograde. And this is the same for all the outer planets. Whereas inner planets, because they're between Earth and the Sun, we see them go retrograde at the beginning and the end of the period, and the middle of that period they disappear behind the Sun's beams. So this is a astronomical diagram that I found online showing how it occurs. So you can see moving from west to east, Mercury is going forward, and then it begins to slow down and turn around, and then where it loops back over itself and returns to forward motion. Whereas at the bottom of the diagram you can see in reality Mercury and Earth are both moving in the same direction, simply Mercury is lapping Earth, Mercury is overtaking Earth. So, just before the retrograde begins, we have what is called greatest elongation. In this instance, greatest evening elongation. So, just before the retrograde, if you were to go and look at the sunset in the west, you would see high in the sky and very bright in the westernly direction, you would see Mercury. And so Mercury is there in the sign of Cancer. You can see the sun is just setting in this image and Mercury is high in the sky in the west. So shortly after the greatest evening elongation, Mercury will station retrograde, and within about a week or so, Mercury will disappear. Usually within 15 degrees of the Sun, most planets will struggle to be seen. So Mercury disappears after this point and remains invisible for a couple weeks. And in the halfway period of the entire retrograde itself, we have the Mercury Cazimi. So this is when Mercury is conjunct the Sun within 1 degree. It's important to note that because any planet that's too close to the Sun, because we can't see it, it is said to be combust. That is, that the Sun's heat and fire has actually burnt up the attributes of the planet, and it loses power. The Cazimi is likened to being in the throne room of the king with the king. It is a visitation with the supreme power, which is the Sun in this instance. And so this specific point, this halfway point in the retrograde cycle, is actually a more beneficial time because Mercury is actually empowered in this moment rather than being debilitated with retrograde motion and a lack of visibility. So, after this point, Mercury continues in its retrograde motion until it will station direct and we get what's called the greatest morning elongation. So you can see on the left side of the chart there, where the ascendant is, the Sun is just about to rise, and we will see Mercury again high in the eastern sky before sunrise. And so that's what's happening astronomically with Mercury retrograde. So here's the timeline. On June 2nd, we entered the shadow period at 5 degrees of Cancer. So this refers to the fact that Mercury will retrograde back to 5 degrees. Okay, these are like the term limits, right? These are this is the playing field of the retrograde. It's between 14 degrees of Cancer and 5 degrees of Cancer. And so this area where Mercury crosses its own path a total of 3 times, going forwards, going back, and going forwards again, that whole area is referred to as a shadow area or period. Then on June 18th, Mercury stations retrograde at 14 degrees Cancer. Should also note that on the 21st of June, we have a solar eclipse at 0 degrees Cancer. That is the day after the summer solstice. And on June 25th, Venus stations direct. Venus has been retrograde for a while now, a couple of months. On June 30th, we have the second part of the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. The first time this happened was several months ago when the economy massively tanked after being stimulated. That was in response to the pandemic, of course. So we get that again. And then on July 1st, we get the halfway point of the Mercury Cazimi at 9 degrees of Cancer. On July 5th, we have a full moon, which is partially eclipsed at 13 degrees of Capricorn. That will just dim slightly if it's visible in your area. It's not going to be an impressive eclipse visually. Then on July 8th, Mars squares Mercury. That's occurring from 6 degrees of Aries to 6 degrees of Cancer. That will probably be quite an unpleasant day, especially given what's happening in the United States right now, other protests in cities across the world. On July 12th, Mercury stations direct at 5 degrees of Cancer. So this is the actual end of the retrograde motion itself, but at this point, Mercury is still very slow. Mercury will barely move for a couple days and then slowly start speeding up as it returns to direct motion. On the 26th, Mercury leaves the shadow period, right, at 14 degrees of Cancer. So at that point, the entire retrograde cycle itself is actually over. However, the next day, because Mercury has gone back and allowed Mars to overtake it, on July 27th, Mercury catches back up to Mars. So we have another Mars square Mercury. Again, that will probably be quite unpleasant. And in some sense, the entire retrograde is defined by Mercury's relationship to Mars. At this point in time, although Mercury is not actually stationed retrograde yet, it's in a trine with Mars from Pisces. But you see, by July 8th, that square goes exact for the first time. It will be rough. Tempers are going to be high. Anyway, so here are some other chart images where you can actually see the degrees of what's going on. So this is the beginning of the shadow period, Mercury at 5 degrees of Cancer. This is Mercury turning retrograde at 14 degrees. You can see the sun is still in late Gemini there. And here's the solar eclipse, just for context. It's going to be quite an intense solar eclipse if it's visible in your area. And here you see Mars is entered Aries a few days earlier. This is the halfway point of the retrograde, the Cazimi, at 9 degrees. Now here we have Mercury stationing direct. This is the end of the cycle, but you can see Mercury is at 5 degrees of Cancer, Mars is at 8 degrees of Aries, so Mercury now will begin to move forward, and as it does so, it moves directly into a square that it's receiving from Mars. So this part of the retrograde is going to be quite intense in particular, or this part of the cycle, I should say. And we'll feel that up until the final Mars-Mercury square. So how's this going to play out on the world stage? Well, most of you aren't going to be surprised by what I'm about to say. It's going to be unpleasant. There's a lot of protests happening at the moment, and in amongst those protests, there's also a lot of violence occurring that shouldn't be occurring. There are riots, there are improper use of police force. So in particular, I think we're going to see a lot of dissatisfaction with the mainstream media. This is something that's been building up for a couple of years already, but we've reached a point where there's a sort of critical mass of fake news flying around. People are upset with media biases. They can't get clear and accurate information. Everything is clouded by political ideology, or is designed to be polarizing in the first place. So a good example of this is the New York Times editor who recently resigned. This person had written an op-ed on the fact that the protests had been partially hijacked by a small minority of violent rioters. And essentially the paper made him apologize and resign, and as a result we've seen the New York Times go to an extreme left-wing position, which is quite strange. It used to be a very sort of renowned, kind of like balanced and centrist paper. Social media censorship and censorship in general is a big issue right now. You've got the whole Twitter versus Facebook debate. Should we be censoring and fact-checking? Should we not? Personally, I think freedom of speech is the most important thing. Anyway, media and government will end up changing their position in the next month on some of the big issues. That's not going to be surprising to anyone. It's a highly polarizing time right now, and we don't have a lot of information. It's very confusing, right? This is a sort of staple of Mercury Retrograde. It can be difficult to get a clear perspective because it seems like the informational land that we're working on is constantly shifting and is unstable inherently. Something I've also heard about recently, in amongst the other defund movements occurring right now, is Defund the BBC, which is actually kind of justified. For people who aren't British, essentially, if you want to watch television in the UK, you have to pay a fee to the government, and that fee is paying the wage for the BBC. And so by paying that fee to the BBC, you then get access to all the television channels. And the thing here is that all the other channels have to use advertising to make their money. In Britain in particular, people are quite dissatisfied with the media. I certainly am. Initially, when the George Floyd protests kicked off, the UK media was very slow to cover this story. And initially they didn't mention any violence of any kind, be it from rioters or from members of law enforcement. Additionally, a couple of weeks later, the BBC barely gave any coverage on the UK George Floyd protests. It wasn't until 2 days after that they occurred that we were actually getting information from the BBC. And even then, they were focused on the police, what happened to the police, what the police did. They didn't mention the fact that there were people throwing bottles and other objects at the police, who were also completely unprepared. The police didn't have riot gear or anything. They were just regular police officers. Anyway, so the media generally has failed to distinguish between peaceful protesters who support the cause and wish to end police brutality, and opportunistic rioters who seem to be quite happy to upend society for the sake of it. What the people really want is clear information that is not biased, not polarized, clouded by other intentions. And until the media can actually do this, people are going to continue to dislike their work. Anyway, that's all for today. Be safe out there.